Welcome back to another edition of Stand on Guard. Just awaiting Colonel Douglas McGregor to join the show. And in the meantime, though, this is an incredible comment from President Donald Trump.
How was Prime Minister Carney towards you?
Very good.
Yeah.
It couldn't have been nicer. We enjoyed the Canada stay a lot. And I had to come back, obviously, for what's happening in the Middle East. But I got everything done. He's a good man. I think Carney's a good man. Very well. A good representative of Canada.
You think he's liked by the people?
I think so, yeah.
Yeah, well, it's highly debatable how likable how liked Mark Carney is by Canadians. So we will continue to ask why Donald Trump is such a fan of Mark Carney. Is it because they really belong to the same club? Is it because they're basically, yes, and Colonel McGregor is here. And we'll Colonel McGregor, thank you. Welcome to the show again, and it's always a pleasure to listen to your analysis. I think you're probably the best out there in terms of what's actually happening in this world right now. But I wanted to start with Donald Trump's strategy in the Middle East, and because you have spoken extensively on this, but what in your opinion is going on with President Donald Trump right now, just 48 hours before the ceasefire, which apparently Iran and Israel were kind of surprised by? Donald Trump was promoting regime change on Truth Social. He said it's maybe politically incorrect to talk about regime change, but why not? It'll make Iran great again. 48 hours later, he was saying, God bless Iran. Do you think he did this turnaround, this turnabout within 2 days because he was seeing the potential for losing support among the really hardcore MAGA supporters? Because there was criticism from Tucker Carlson, Steve Bannon. Do you think that had something to do with this?
Well, the short answer, I think, is no. First of all, I'm not sure I would dignify what's happening with the word strategy. Strategy suggests that you have a specific purpose in mind, you have carefully devised a way to achieve that purpose, and that you have some end state in mind. In other words, there's something you want to achieve at the other end of that process. I think that President Trump is by nature extremely impulsive, and if anything, he's very reactive. And right now, he is surrounded by people who are, to put it mildly, extraordinarily committed and devoted to the state of Israel and the international cause that backs the Israeli state. So I think that has to be borne in mind. And if anything occurred that was a tipping point, I think it was probably the fact that the Israelis are running out of both cash and missiles. You got to remember that every time you fire a missile at someone, at the other end, somebody fires 2 or 3 missiles at the one incoming missile in order to protect themselves. Well, it doesn't take very long to do the math. If you have, say, 500 missiles shot at you and you're firing 1,000 to stop them, you inevitably are going to run out of missiles. And you're going to run out of missiles faster on the defensive side than your opponent will on the offensive side. So I think that's very much the case. I know that the U.S. Navy is very close to dipping too deeply into its own arsenal. And we fired at least 100 or more missiles to try and defeat the incoming Iranian missiles. So that's the first part. And remember, we only produce, I think it's about 660 missiles like Patriot every year. We're trying to increase the numbers that we produce, but we don't have the manufacturing base we once did. We don't have any surge capacity. Surge capacity is always what saved us in the past, the ability to turn to industry and say, I need 30,000 of X, industry gears up and produces it. We just don't have that capability, whereas the Russians have demonstrated pretty conclusively that they do have it, and I'm absolutely confident the Chinese do. Now, having said all that, the other thing is cash. The Israeli economy is falling apart. Well, some people would say it's already in ruins. It's going to implode. The finance minister, Mr. Smotrich, made a statement just a couple of days ago telling everyone we've got maybe a week, perhaps 2 weeks left. And then this thing we call the economy is gone. It just implodes and we go into a state that's moribund. So the two things I think that were really critical at this stage were the lack of missiles and the inability to replace those and replenish those. And then finally, the cash. Now, as far as Iran is concerned, I think Iran was persuaded primarily by President Putin, but probably not only President Putin. I'm sure that President Xi probably weighed in on this to back down. The Iranians had taken damage, but there's a vast difference between the damage you inflict on a nation of 92 million with a few hundred missiles and the damage you inflict on a nation of 9 million, of which 2 million are Arabs and 7 million are Jews, in an area the size of New Jersey when Iran is the size of Western Europe. And I think they were told, look, you've won the argument. You in Iran have made your point. You cannot be conquered. So take the victory and stand down for the moment, and let's see what we can achieve. So I think as a result of those interventions and the fact that Mr. Netanyahu and his government made it very clear, either directly to President Trump or through their agents in the White House, that this had to stop and they needed a breather, we get what we get. And that's what we have is a ceasefire. We don't know if it'll last 2 days, 2 weeks, 2 months. It's anybody's guess. But I don't think the Iranians, under any circumstances, will be the ones to break it when the time comes. If it's going to be broken and a fight is to be resumed, it'll be done by Israel.
So you're essentially saying the war is sputtering to a halt because the cash is running out and the armaments are running out in this instance. So this is not a political consideration. It's just brass tacks. So this is about, we don't have the money to keep the war going and we don't have the supply. So I think that would make perfect sense. But Donald Trump at NATO, at the NATO summit, I found his attitude to be, well, shall we say, perplexing. And it seems that he was moving away from NATO at one point, and of course, almost talking about it like it was an organization that was past its due date, that perhaps it was time to move on because it was really not doing much to contain any kind of European security, so much as it was encouraging animosity towards Russia. But I just want to play this clip and get your comment. I'm sure you've seen it a dozen times already, but it's fascinating.
We may do papers on it, Marco. Maybe we're going to do papers. I don't even know if you need them. They're not going to be fighting each other. They've had it. They've had a big fight, like two kids in a schoolyard. You know, they fight like hell. You can't stop them. Let them fight for about 2-3 minutes. Then it's easier to stop them.
And then Daddy has to sometimes use strong language.
You have to use strong language. Every once in a while, you have to use a certain word.
Now, that is, to me, a very bizarre moment because NATO's been very critical of Donald Trump over the past couple of years, suggesting that they're asking for too much, that they can't expect Europe to put more money into it. And now, of course, they're talking 5% of GDP threshold. And praising Donald Trump for being a visionary, that he is the one that encouraged Europe to do this. And Daddy, it's almost inexplicable that the Secretary General of NATO, Mark Rutte, would use terminology like that, referring to somebody who I think most of the NATO countries really don't have a lot of time for. They don't like Donald Trump, but yet the sycophancy going on here, the obsequiousness, the getting on their knees and just praising Donald Trump with all of their fervor. Do you think, I mean, what's going on here as far as you're concerned in terms of what is NATO trying to achieve? Because they want to rearm Europe. Now, but I'll get to that in a minute. But do you really think NATO believes that if they get Donald Trump on side right now, that the security of this organization is basically going to be maintained? Because if the U.S. ever left NATO, I think NATO would implode, and I'm sure you probably agree with that. But it looks like Donald Trump is now a huge fan of NATO. Has this been a complete transformation?
I can say with absolute certainty from personal experience with him that 7 years ago, his views were exactly as you outlined them at the beginning. He was questioning the wisdom of the whole NATO alliance. Why are we there? He did not believe in the great threat from Russia that has been perpetrated recently with such success in the United States and elsewhere. He saw no value long-term in it and felt strongly that we should find a way to sort of quietly disengage. So I think that's true. Well, what's changed? Again, I go back to my earlier statement. He's reacting. He's reacting to different pressures. Now, before we go any further about President Trump, let's back up and look at Europe. You've got to distinguish the globalist elites who are currently ruling most of the European countries, particularly in the West, from the populations and the electorates. Now, in places like Norway, I get the impression that the population is as delusional as their leaders. And to a large extent, that seems to apply in Sweden and Finland in the sense that they see a threat that doesn't exist. They live in fear of that threat, and they're willing to invest heavily to, quote unquote, protect themselves from the threat. How long will that last? It will last until the people in those countries wake up and discover that's not the case. Now, when you go to Germany or Poland or Slovakia or Hungary, then you get an entirely different picture, as you do in Italy and Spain. And I think increasingly in France, people have said, wait a minute, we've been hearing this for a long time. We don't see any evidence for it. You're telling us that the Russians are gearing up to march to the West and reconquer the Warsaw Pact. And yet you tell us at the same time the Russians are incompetent, inefficient, ineffective. Their economy is weak, and their forces are so poor that they can't simply crush Ukraine in a matter of a few weeks. So I think the cognitive dissonance is beginning to take effect. That I think needs to be borne in mind. So somebody like Rutte, for instance, I just happened to look at some of the Dutch news feed this morning, quite by accident. I know you were going to mention him. And the Dutch, were willing to swallow a lot of things and still do. They're closer, unfortunately, to the Norwegians and some of their self-delusion about the evil Russians. But they had a marvelous cartoon that showed Rutte bending over and sniffing the posterior of Donald Trump and saying, this is what it's come to. I don't think there is a long-term future for NATO. I never have. And I don't think it has, contrary to popular belief, it's not entirely contingent on us. I think as it becomes clear the world has changed and the people in Europe will recognize that they don't all share the same interests. This whole thing of what is Europe? Europe is a conglomerate of radically different peoples in radically different geographical regions that see the world very differently depending upon where they sit. If you're in Rome or Madrid, you see the world very differently from the people in Berlin or Stockholm or Warsaw. So I think NATO is going to go away. There's no question about that. And we can't afford it. We're very fragile financially and economically. So what I would say again about Donald Trump is that he's adopted this for the moment, this view. And this view could change very, very quickly, just in the next few weeks, depending upon events and whatever is important to him or the people that are handling him.
Well, this sort of whiplash foreign policy that we're seeing from the Trump administration right now can't be can't really be reassuring the base very much. But even the mainstream media wasn't buying this attitude from Mark Rutte yesterday.
Go ahead, give my mic. Hello.
Deborah Haynes from Sky News.
Good.
Mark Rutte, the NATO chief, who is your friend, he called you daddy earlier. Do you regard your NATO allies as kind of children?
No, he likes me. I think he likes me. If he doesn't, I'll let you know. I'll come back and I'll hit him hard, okay? No? He did it very affectionate. Daddy, you're my daddy.
Do you regard your NATO allies, though, as kind of like children, and they're obviously listening to you and they're spending more, and you're obviously appreciative of that, but do you hope that actually they're going to be able to defend themselves, defend you?
I find this frightening, Colonel McGregor, because it seems like all you have to do to move Donald Trump from what was supposed to be a hardcore position to a completely different one is flatter. Flatter the man. Tell him he's the daddy. We're your kids. You're in control. We love you so much, President Trump. I find that really, really worrisome, especially when he's now saying this. It's impossible Putin will invade more than Ukraine. Now, that's been the talking point of NATO ever since Ukraine was invaded. They never talk about the 2014 coup. They never talk about what happened in the Donbass region. It was all about not only this horrible invasion of Ukraine, but the fact that Poland's next, and goodness gracious, Austria, Czechoslovakia might be next. He wants to reimpose the old Soviet Union on Eastern Europe. And I just find this incredible, because Donald Trump would not have been saying this 6 months ago, that Putin wants more than Ukraine. And is that all you have to do is flatter Donald Trump, and he'll jump onto your bandwagon?
Well, it certainly helps. He's someone who I think suffers from an acute case of NPD. You're familiar with that, aren't you? NPD. Narcissistic
what is
personality disorder.
Oh, okay. Yes, I've heard.
In other words, he thrives on being worshipped. And that's what the people that surround him understand, and the people that want something from him have learned, that you essentially worship at the altar of Donald Trump. And if you do so, you can get pretty much whatever you want. It is a very dangerous set of circumstances, and it tends to influence him. He's very emotional. As I said, he's impulsive and reactive. What you want from someone in his position, particularly the size of the United States, the kind of potential power and influence that it has and sometimes exercises, is a degree of stability and certainty. That's what people in Asia in particularly thrive on. That's the essence of good statesmanship. That's good government. The leadership provides predictability, provides security, provides understanding what the national interest is and staying focused on it. The United States is so radically different because we, like you, live on this island called North America, surrounded by water. And we really haven't had to think very hard and long about our national interests. And so we don't. And so if you're looking for a coherent national strategy, let alone a coherent national military strategy, well, that doesn't exist. And Donald Trump simply plays it as he moves down the field. There is no predisposition to do anything in any particular direction. So if you listen to his remarks now, and you go back to the remarks he made in the run-up to his presidential election, it's very, very clear that he's a different person. Well, he's not really a different person, but he's saying different things because it suits him at the moment. It's not rooted in anything. But unfortunately, it is consistent with the globalist clique that is governing the West. And that's what's really tragic and sad for his supporters, for people like me who voted for him and others, because we voted in the belief that he could direct us down a different path. And he's turned out to change back to whatever it was that preceded him. Yeah, somebody said the other day, we go to the polls, we vote, and regardless of whomever we elect, we end up with McCain as president. And a lot of people are now saying, well, you have an orange McCain as president. And that suits the Senate. It suits most of the House. It sustains existing money flows. It changes nothing. And in Washington, the one thing that you recognize early on when you spend time there is that no one at the top in the Congress, which benefits financially on an individual basis from all the things that we do that are stupid and self-defeating, no one there wants anything to change. They just want to maintain the money flow. And Trump was hated initially when he came into office the first time because he threatened to disrupt that money flow. And I think the same thing is true to a large extent inside the European Union and NATO. People just want this thing to continue in perpetuity, which is why you have people creating these non-existent threats from Russia. It's a way to hold this failing alliance together. So I wish I had a better explanation for you. I wish I could ground this in some degree of strategic rationality, but I'm afraid I can't.
Well, perhaps that's because there is no underlying rational reason for any of this. And I think a lot of people have been disappointed by some of the people in this administration. They really held up in high regard because they were principled people. And I'm thinking, of course, about Tulsi Gabbard. And here's Tulsi Gabbard's latest. This mystifies me, Colonel, because Tulsi Gabbard said in March there was no nuclear program. There were no nuclear weapons, but yet they've been destroyed. So I'm watching this and I'm saying, how can anybody take these people completely seriously when this is the same director of national intelligence who said there's no evidence for this in March, no evidence that Iran is anywhere close to producing a nuclear weapon. And now she says, but we destroyed them all. These non-existent nuclear weapons. Is this theater of the absurd, or how should we approach this as just completely? It's almost like satire.
Well, I'm not sure this is really a new phenomenon. You're just seeing it in a new form right now, and that is this is the line, the policy line. This is what I'm saying: get on board or get off. And I think Tulsi Gabbard was told, look, you want to stay in your job, fine, then get on board. If you're not going to get on board, then you're going to be off. You're going to be fired. You're going to be asked to resign. I think that's true for everybody in the cabinet. Everybody understands that. Look, this is not new. If you go back to the beginning of World War I in Great Britain, there were two members of the sort of National Council led by the Prime Minister who strongly objected to the notion of going to war with Germany. And they made it very clear, we have no reason to go to war with Germany. This obscure treaty that we signed on to almost 100 years ago for this artificial state called Belgium is not really our concern. There is no threat to Great Britain because the Royal Navy is so large and so powerful, any attempt by anybody on the continent to cross the channel is doomed to failure. And the Germans, by the way, don't regard us as the enemy and they don't want a war with us. So we should not enter the war. Well, ultimately, they did enter the war. Why? Because the two members, one of whom was a man named Lansdale, one of those two members that objected resigned. And what was left over was unanimity. And that unanimity included, of course, the McCain of an earlier era called Churchill. And the rest is history. And Britain went into that war. And that war, more than any other war, in my judgment, destroyed the British Empire. Didn't destroy it overnight, but it so severely weakened it and undermined it that it made its inevitable fall much earlier than would have otherwise been the case. And yet, at the time they went to war, these fools in London thought they were defending the British Empire. Same thing was true in 1939. So what I'm trying to tell you that this crosses national lines. Countries do things, their leaders do things for stupid reasons. And then they tell the populace what they think will mobilize national sentiment, and off they go. This is not new, and that's exactly what's going on with Donald Trump. And he has what I would call a cult following. There are many people on the so-called MAGA side who are not happy because they see clearly this is a betrayal. And I think he is losing a lot of support right now there. But does it really matter to him? He can't be voted out. There is no confidence vote that could be held in Parliament that would remove him. So he's quite safe right now. And I think he had a scare. I think he thought this war was going to go too far. And if it went too far and Israel were destroyed, he would be destroyed. Everything would fall apart. I think he's still worried about that, though he may not say so publicly. And that's where we are right now. And in the meantime, we have this sovereign national debt that climbs by another trillion every so many months. There are no cuts in spending, and he won't lead any because that requires real moral courage. Nobody in Washington has that. And that means telling the American people that there will be some measure of austerity to deal with the sovereign national debt. Nobody wants to sell that to the American people. I mean, everything is for optics. In other words, how does it look? If it looks good, it must be good. I spend time on the Mexican border, and the Mexican border right now looks 100% better than it did when Biden was there. But then I was told the grim truth that the drug trafficking and the human trafficking that is most dangerous and problematic continues uninterrupted. I said, well, how can that happen? He said, well, it comes through the legal crossing points, the legal ports of entry. It continues to pour, and it pours in through the ports. It comes in not just to the Mexican border, but between the United States and Canada. And the customs officers, in many cases, are bought off. In other words, the cartels have enough money to buy everyone, so they'll all look the other way. In other words, the optics are one thing, the reality is another. And right now in Washington, what they care about more than anything else is especially true for President Trump, is the optics.
Kind of fascinating. While NATO is pushing for 5% of the GDP threshold, at the same time, the European Union is creating something called a Rearm Europe program, of which Canada has been hauled into, promising to donate billions and potentially even join this organization, although Mark Carney doesn't seem to realize we reside in North America, not Europe, and I don't know why he can't draw that distinction. But 225 billion euros for a Rearm Europe program. Now, as you pointed out, every time Europe rearms, there's usually a world war. We had a huge festering rearmament between the years 1910 and 1914. Even before that, there was an arms race in Europe. We had Germany rearm in the 1930s, and Britain was rearming at the same time. And in both cases, we had a world war. Is it not only redundant to have two organs of collective defense, collective security, or two military alliance systems for Europe, competing for dollars and apparently media attention as well? Is it not just redundant but dangerous? Because is this not all about trying to isolate Russia again, demonize Russia as the enemy of world peace, the enemy of humanity, and these crackpots like Keir Starmer and Emmanuel Macron seriously talk about going to war with Russia? Obviously, this seems to be why they want to raise 225 billion euros to finance this new collective security organization. So, what do you make of that?
Well, it's foolish nonsense. But let's talk a little bit about your prime minister, who's made the decision to obviously invest in equipment and technology produced in Europe versus what we produce. And that's a sore point. That's a direct barb at Trump. Howard Lutnick, who is one of the key figures in the administration, a couple of weeks ago was meeting with some business leaders from India. And one of the leaders from India said, Mr. Lutnick, what can we do that would make you happy about us and pleased with us? And his answer was, well, we'd be happy if you bought more of our military equipment instead of Russia's. Well, if you're an Indian right now and you have a long-term relationship with Russia that goes back decades, virtually to the founding of the Indian state, and you live in very close proximity to Russia, why would you invest in military equipment from the United States when you have supply chains that have to reach, thousands of miles back to America? It's not going to happen. But I thought what was important about the exchange was Lutnick's insistence that was important. Now, this is a real sore point with Donald Trump, because right now, when you look at our economy, what do we produce? Well, we produce oil and natural gas. We do have some mineral deposits, but primarily oil and natural gas. We also have a hell of a lot of coal, which we are not making full use of, that we can produce and ship overseas. The other thing that we produce, of course, are crops. We still are an agricultural power. We haven't managed it as well as we should, and we haven't capitalized on it the way we should, in my judgment, but we are still an agricultural power. But what do we manufacture? What do we build? Not much. As a result, we tend to build a lot of military equipment and stuff. And that is important to President Trump because it maintains assembly lines, it keeps them open. So if you really want to aggravate President Trump and you will really want to harm him in some way, you do exactly what your prime minister has done and say, fine, we're not going to use any of your equipment. We're going to use whatever is built in Europe. So that's the easy answer to the question about Canada right now and the attitude towards Trump.
Final question to Colonel. The Golden Dome. Donald Trump's talking about having a Golden Dome not just over Israel, which is a much smaller area, but one over North America. And he's told Mark Carney, it's for 61 billion. You too can have membership in the North American Golden Dome. You've referred to the Golden Dome over Israel as a sieve, because very, very little of the effort made to stop every missile from coming in actually succeeds. A lot of missiles are getting through. This is not a foolproof system. But two parts to this. Do you think the Golden Dome for North America is even militarily realizable? Is it or is this some sort of abstraction, much the way the Strategic Defense Initiative was under Ronald Reagan? That was a great idea, but the technology wasn't there in the 80s. I'm not sure the technology's here in the 2020s to make the Golden Dome work. And what concerns me is that Planeteer is involved in this. And could this become not a mechanism for aerial defense, but for surveillance? And is this a possibility?
Well, that's quite a question. First of all, you're right. The Iron Dome is what you're referring to in Israel, and that has turned out to be far, far less effective than as advertised. But you've got to look at what people do in the defense industries, whether it's Israel or here or anywhere else. They always are hyperbolic and make claims that they're simply not founded in reality. And that's the first part. The second part is the Golden Dome is very clearly a warmed over reiteration of the Strategic Defense Initiative. And the Strategic Defense Initiative was very, very popular. Why? It's a money pit. It transfers billions and billions of dollars in wealth from the American people to various corporate entities in the defense industry, and also to some extent in the scientific community. I was actually teaching at West Point when Teller, the great architect of the Strategic Defense Initiative, came to speak to us. He was trying to present himself as kind of an Einstein. Some of you may remember that Einstein sent a letter back in the 1930s to Franklin Roosevelt and told him that he knew the key figures in Germany who were really the geniuses behind modern physics, and he knew that they could conceivably build an atomic weapon. And so he urged FDR at the time to look into building one here before they did. And as a result, you got the Manhattan Project. Well, I think Teller has tried to present himself as another Einstein. And of course, you had only too many people eager to chip in and join this throng that would build this perfect dome over the United States that they called the SDI. You're right. We couldn't break the laws of fractal mathematics or physics and ultimately build force fields on the Star Trek model, which would work. Unfortunately, we can't build them. We can't power them. Now, perhaps the aliens we've all been waiting to meet that will land at some point in front of the Washington Monument will enter and tell us this is the secret to the Golden Dome. But barring that, no, absolutely. You're not going to get anywhere with this, but it'll be a brilliant money pit. And that's the sad part. And it won't work because given the state of current technology, if you've learned anything from the war in eastern Ukraine, anything from what you've just seen with Israel and Iran, it is that any defensive system can be overwhelmed in time by an opponent's missiles. If you build enough missiles, fire enough missiles, you will overwhelm and destroy the air defense. And just to give you a quick anecdote, during the Second World War, we in the Royal Air Force, and I would include the Royal Canadian Air Force in that connection, lost 18,000 bombers trying to penetrate German air defenses, which for the time were state of the art. And ultimately they succeeded, but they had to lose 18,000 bombers to get there. I don't think we're in a position to do that sort of thing anymore. And I don't think that we can produce enough anti-missiles to protect ourselves from a determined offensive strike. And that ultimately is the foundation or basis for mutual assured destruction, which frankly has kept the peace. And there were many people at the time when the SDI business started, and I hear these things now from people in the scientific community saying, you know, we don't want to create the illusion that we have the answer that will solve the mad dilemma. In other words, that we can get past mutual assured destruction. And the danger is that your potential adversaries or opponents will then double down and build that many more missiles to penetrate your defense. So it's kind of a pointless exercise, but it does promise to make a lot of people on the Hill, that is in Congress, as well as a lot of corporate heads and what we call shareholders, very, very wealthy. So I suspect on that basis alone, it will get off the ground initially.
And I think Mark Carney will buy into it because for the same reasons you've mentioned, because of corporate cronyism and because he wants to look like he's right on side with Donald Trump and all this. And I have to say you're quite right about bomber commands, fatality figures in the Second World War. The only more unsafe place to be was in a U-boat in the Second World War. The fatality rate was like 60%. Incredible. Not casualty, fatality rate in bomber command. And I've spoken to so many veterans over the years who said it was like a nightmare going out at 10 o'clock at night and being attacked when you couldn't even see the aircraft coming at you. And it was a horrible experience. But David, anyway, I know you're busy and I know you've got another interview. Thank you so much for your time today, Colonel. We love you on the show and we follow the work you're doing. Keep it up, please.
Well, David, before I leave, I think it's wonderful that you mentioned what you did, because today we don't understand what real war entails. For us, war is always something that happens on someone else's territory. Nothing touches us here. We have to stop that. We're no longer invincible, invulnerable, invisible. And if we're not careful, we continue down the road that we're on in the United States, war will visit us. That's my greatest concern. So I'm glad you mentioned that. Thanks.
Thank you again, sir. And we'll talk again.
Right. Bye-bye.
Bye for now. That was Colonel Douglas McGregor, former colonel in the United States Army, and he was a senior advisor to a former Secretary of Defense under the first Donald Trump administration. Wish he was in the current Donald Trump administration. This is a man of tremendous wisdom, sagacity, and experience, and who really calls the shots as he sees them, and I think he sees them very accurately. I'll be right back with some concluding remarks. Let's have a look at our story. Thanks for joining me today, folks. It's a pleasure to bring guests like Colonel Douglas McGregor to you, and fantastic conversation. I hope it was enriching for all of you. Thanks for watching today, and I will be back tomorrow, possibly even this afternoon. It's rainy today here in Ottawa. But I've been broadcasting live. This has been Stand on Guard. I'm your host, David Krayden. Thank you for watching. We'll be back again soon.